share a screen PowerPoint, and we'll after she's done, we'll go directly to Stephanie's comments, and after that, we'll go to Representative Ferrari, and she'll talk about two things, but the 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 House Bill 69 and the Hunger Caucus. So without further ado, Marigold already introduced herself, so I'll give the floor to her.
Thank you. It always takes a second to get sharing. I guess before I share, actually, I would just like to say thank you very much for inviting me. And I really appreciate, Carlos, that we went around and heard from everybody about who they are. It reminds me that there's always time to build community, even when we are over Zoom and online. And I just really appreciate taking the time for that. So thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me. Now I'll share. Okay. So I'm hoping that that is working. And the sad part about sharing screen is that I don't get to see everyone's faces, but I think that if you speak up, if you stop me and you speak up, then I'll be able to see you. And if you have any questions, feel free to do that. Just to get started and to introduce the study and the research that we've been working on. We call it the Basic Needs Study at the University of New Mexico, and it is not my work alone. Obviously, we've already heard from Sarita Kargas, who is my co-leader, co-PI on this project. And we also have a number of other really wonderful participants in our research team, including Dr. Catherine Coakley from the Nutrition and Dietetics Program, and Heather Meckler, who is the director of the Office of Institutional Analytics at UNM. And I didn't put the other names of our team on here, but we do have another group of us that are working on developing interventions and solutions. And we also have a number of students that we work with, actually sort of a coming and going group of students. So it's a group that changes and brings more people in, and then we are always excited to bring people in with new ideas and energies. So just to give you a little bit of background around this project started really maybe about 2 years ago. Sarita and I started talking about the kinds of things that we were teaching in our class. I teach a class on food and society, and we always do a unit on food security. And I do a unit on food security in the United States in general, and increasingly was starting to see more and more literature coming out talking about college students. And I'm always looking for ways to make all of my classes, my teaching, more relevant and interesting to students. And so of course I started to look into this new literature on food insecurity among college students. And I was really, I wasn't necessarily surprised because I was myself a food insecure student, but I was maybe surprised about the extent of it, because we're seeing across the board that food insecurity is so much more prevalent among college students than the rest of the population, as maybe you have talked about before. So what we decided to do after Dr. Kargas and I kind of were talking about it, she teaches on global hunger, I teach more on food insecurity in the United States, is we decided that we needed to understand what was happening at UNM. And there were reasons why we thought that it might be particularly high, right? Because we know that in New Mexico, as the state as a whole, has the highest prevalence of food insecurity for the whole state. And we also know that food insecurity is higher among minority populations. And since we are a minority serving institution, we thought that also might mean that we had higher rates. So as we kind of got going, we started to say, we really need to figure this out. We need to know from our students what is going on. So the goals of the project is to understand the prevalence and patterns of basic needs insecurity. I'm going to turn my clock on to make sure that I don't go too long. To understand the patterns and prevalence of basic needs insecurity among UNM students. And by basic needs insecurity, I'm talking about both food and housing insecurity. And I understand that this group is primarily interested in food insecurity, but I will tell you a little bit also about what we find with the housing situation as well. The broader goal is to develop solutions or figure out ways that we might have some interventions to support student health, well-being, and academic success, because we know that food insecurity is patterned across demographic group. And if it is patterned across demographic group, then what we're talking about is equitable access to education. So that's really kind of underlying what our project is interested in, is because we are interested in equitable access. We do have a website that is basicneeds.unm.edu where we post all of our reports, our team members, all of those things. So if you're interested to know more, you can go to that website, and you can always, of course, email me or Dr. Kargas. So I'm sure you all know all of this stuff since you are already interested in food and hunger issues, but I'll go pretty quickly through this. So we use in our study 2 different assessments. We do food security and housing security. And for food security, we use the US Department of Agriculture's 10-question assessment. And really what food security means that it means that all members of the household have access at all times to enough food for a healthy, active life. And so we see that there is, in food secure homes, ready availability of nutritionally adequate and safe housing, and the ability to acquire these goods, this food, in socially acceptable ways. So the flip side of that is that food insecurity means limited or uncertain availability of foods. And I just want to point out that the USDA has these categorizes food security in terms of 4 different levels. The top 2 are categorized as food secure, and the bottom 2 are food insecure. And the reason I want to highlight this is because I want to just emphasize maybe the difference between hunger and food insecurity, or just bring attention to that, because we are not just looking at hunger. I know this group is primarily focused on hunger, but we are also looking at food insecurity. So the very low food security is where you might see hunger reside. You might see people making choices where, not making choices, but maybe actually skipping meals, not getting their caloric requirements. Maybe part of the household is not eating enough so that maybe children or others in the household can eat enough. So very low food security is where you might see some hunger. But low food security is also food insecure. And this is where you might see lots of uncertainty or worry about whether there is going to be enough food. And there might be a shifting away from the kinds of food that people want to eat towards maybe more lower quality foods, maybe foods that are less desirable, less repetition, or more repetition rather, less variety in foods. And so just to emphasize that we're looking at both of these in terms of food insecurity, because we find that the uncertainty and worry that goes along with even the low food security, even if you're not hungry, there is still some real stress and some impact of that food insecurity as well. Housing security is something that we are also looking at in our study. I'll go through this pretty quickly. There isn't the same kind of agreement around measurements of housing security. There's homelessness, which is sort of analogous to hunger, in that it's sort of the most difficult and most challenging of the housing security. I'm going to skip pretty quickly through these, but just in general, housing insecurity means limited or uncertain access to stable, safe, adequate, and affordable housing. And the way that we measured it in our study is through a set of 9 questions. We use the same measurement tools as the Hope Center for College, Community, and Justice, which is sort of the leader on college level food insecurity and housing insecurity. And we wanted to be able to compare across different sites. But in general, housing insecurity doesn't have the same kind of consensus around measurement. The kinds of questions that we asked are things like, were you able to pay the full amount of your rent or your utilities? Were you summoned to housing court? Did you have to temporarily stay with other people because of an inability to pay rent? Were you living in a house beyond the expected capacity of a resident? So was there crowding in your apartment or in your home? Did you have to move frequently? So if anybody said yes to any of these, then they were categorized as housing insecure. So what we did is that we we spent the first 2 years trying to figure out what we were doing. We came up with our mechanisms, our measurement tools. We came up with our survey. We were intending to enumerate the survey in March of 2020. And as we all know, in March, there was just obviously this incredible thing that happened with the coronavirus and the pandemic. And also in March, the University of New Mexico closed their dorms, and we shifted from in-person learning to online learning. So there was a lot of challenge, there was a lot of uncertainty, we didn't really know, and we had to regroup to decide what we were going to do with our study. We'd spent 2 years planning it and figuring out what we were going to do, building a team, and it seemed like it was all going to just sort of unravel and fall apart. And so we said, no, absolutely not. In fact, especially during COVID is when we especially need to do these kinds of work, because we expect that there might be some particular challenges at this time. So we regrouped and we came back and we did the survey in April. We sent the survey out to 12,000 students using a stratified random sampling method, which the important thing here is that the way that we sampled is we intended for the sample, and we believe that the sample is representative. So we think that these results are able to say something about the entire UNM population. We got back 2,695 responses for a response rate of around 20%, which is quite good actually in this kind of work. And I'll also say, I know I'm speaking to an audience that's not necessarily university professors or researchers, but I get really nerdy about this sort of stuff. So if it's too much and I'm boring you, just let me know. But I love this stuff, and wanted to share some of these details with you. I already mentioned about how we push back our time. So just to get to our findings, because that I think is what is the most important part of tonight. So we found the most important thing I want you to see. I know there's a lot of numbers on here. I just wanted to share all of the numbers with you. But if you look over on the left-hand side, you see under food insecurity, the bold number there is that we found 31.69% of our population, of our students, respondents, reported food insecurity. So that means that 32% of UNM students experience food insecurity in the last 12 months. Of these 32 students, about half, a little under half, are low food security, which means that they might not be experiencing hunger, but they're just experiencing uncertainty. But what is really striking is that 17% of our students are experiencing that very low food security, which is that area where you might be actually skipping meals. You are actually hungry in that category. And this is obviously significantly higher than the population at large. In New Mexico, we did just go down, which was great, but I think we're about 17% in the last study. So this is significantly higher, almost double what the population at large experiences. Okay, so let's see. I can't see it because it's covered up by your faces and my face, but if I move you guys over, maybe, or down. So I wanted to show you that what we're finding here is that the food insecurity is patterned across different demographic groups. And so you can see, first of all, that undergraduate students, relative to graduate students, undergraduate students have relatively higher rates or prevalence of food insecurity than graduate students. You see that in terms of cisgender folks, there isn't really a difference between men and women, but you can see there's a very big difference between the prevalence of food insecurity among non-cisgender folks. So you can see transgender is 46% of our population of trans folks reported food insecurity, and 72% of people who identify as gender fluid, 72. I completely recognize that this is a very low end. There's a very few of these people, but we definitely have very high prevalence among trans and gender fluid. Similar with LGBT students, so lesbian, gay, and bisexual students, we see have much higher incidence of food insecurity than heterosexual students. And we see in terms of race and ethnicity that African American, Asian, African American, American Indian, and international students all have particularly high food insecurity. I highlighted also Hispanic students because they have above average, but in general, this isn't really quite as high as we see in some of the other racial and ethnic groups there. So just what we find right here is that we are reporting significantly higher incidence of food insecurity among college students, probably about double what the rest of the population is, and that it's patterned across different groups, in particular LGBTQ and minority groups, minority students. This is really important to us because we know that we're seeing in the literature that food insecurity causes kind of poor well-being and poor academic outcomes. And so one of the things that we tried to do, and we're just starting this analysis on this, but one of the things that we started to do is to understand how this affects academic outcomes. And so, oops, it's not. So we see one of the things that we looked at is GPA, and you can see here what this is telling you. You can look at the mean GPA under food secure and compare it to mean GPA for food insecure, and you see in both 2019 and 2020, spring 2020, we see that the GPA is significantly, so this is statistically significant, significantly lower among food insecure students. So because these preliminary results make us realize that it's something that we really need to look into. We also suspect and have some indications that DFW rates, so those are drop, fail rates, and withdrawal rates are higher among food insecure students as well. So we are absolutely seeing that this is a matter of access to education. So I'll go through housing insecurity pretty quickly because I know this group isn't necessarily as interested in that, but I think that it's important to see both of these. Housing insecurity we see is about 41% among our entire population in this study. Again, we see that undergraduates experience much higher prevalence of housing insecurity than graduate students do, but still 37% graduate students do experience quite high incidence of housing insecurity. Similar breakdown on the demographics, although we start to see that there is a difference across cisgender folks, so women tend to be more housing insecure than men. But again, we see trans and gender fluid folks, non-cis folks have just this really incredible incidence of housing insecurity. Again, also with kind of gay and lesbian and bisexual, and also students who report not sure, we have higher incidence of housing insecurity. And here we do see that Hispanics seem to be a little bit higher, kind of is maybe more higher incidence among Hispanics than among food insecurity. And we see American Indians, again, over half of them are food insecurity, 2 or more races, African Americans. And then I want to highlight international students because international students emerged in our study as a group of folks who are really actually experiencing this insecurity at pretty high prevalence that we hadn't really anticipated seeing. So we're seeing that as well. So moving on to one last thing. One thing that we're working on right now as we do this data analysis is that we discovered that 20% of our students reported experiencing simultaneously food and housing insecurity. So 1 in 5 students experience both of these burdens of food and housing insecurity. And so we're starting to do some data analysis right now, and I'm really excited to share these with you because this is what I've been working on right now lately. So we see 1 in 5 students have this double burden or experiencing this double burden. Again, we see that non-cisgender folks experience more of a burden, gay, lesbian, bisexual, and those who report not sure or other also experience higher. Again, we see African American, American Indian, and international students experiencing this higher. Let's see, other ones that I want to point out. Here we're also looking at employment and to see if students are able to become employed. And we see that some students are unemployed. Those that are actively looking for work, they experience the double burden, much higher rates. But we also noticed that there are students in our sample who reported not being allowed to work. And these are students whose academic program does not allow them to work. So literally you're not allowed to work outside of your schoolwork in some majors. And we see that translates into a higher incidence of double burden. Another thing that we're looking at in this one also has to do with student parents and students who take care of their own parents. So students who who are taking care of their of children or adults also experience much higher incidence of the double burden of both food and housing insecurity. So let's see. I want to just sort of take a minute to sit here with this double burden information for a second, because I want to just highlight how LGBTQ students, Hispanic, African American, Native, and international students, unemployed students or students that are not allowed to work, and students with dependents are more likely to experience both food and housing insecurity simultaneously than just one or the other. And I think that this is really important because what I want to really raise here is the ways that material hardships and basic needs sort of interact, right? And we're finding out in some of the research that we are doing since then, we're doing some qualitative research in the fall, the ways that students juggle these different kinds of material needs, food and housing. And then another thing that came out really a lot was medical, access to medical care. And so they'll juggle accessing these three needs in ways where they'll decide, oh, I can't really eat this week because I need to pay the dentist to take care of the abscess in my tooth. Or they'll say, this week is when I have to pay my rent, so I'll pay half of my rent so that I can still eat some food as well. So I really want to think about the ways that food insecurity or hunger overlaps with some of these other material hardships. And this is some of the kind of more recent work that we're doing and kind of looking at the ways that they interact, particularly for college students. So just to sort of conclude here, I have sort of 4 takeaway messages, and hopefully I'm more or less on time. My 4 takeaway messages are: first, that college students experience food and housing insecurity at incidences higher than the average population. And this we see not only in our own work, where we see about double what we see in the rest of the New Mexico population, but we're seeing this across the board in lots of different kinds of institutions, lots of different kinds of states, even private institutions, you see that as well, where you might expect that the food insecurity would be lower. You see it in wealthy states, you see it in lots and lots of different kinds of states and places. The second takeaway message is that basic needs insecurity among college students is patterned across demographic groups, right? And so this is definitely a matter of equity or access to education across demographic groups. So if we care about that kind of equity, then we need to think about basic needs security as well. The third takeaway message that I want to highlight is that students are more likely to experience both food and housing insecurity simultaneously than just one or the other. So we have to sort of think of this holistically. And finally, that we have this preliminary work, and we are continuing to do this work, but we are seeing that basic needs insecurity likely really does impact student achievement and success. And so paying attention to food and housing insecurity is important in terms of accessing education. And so what's next for this project? What are we kind of working on now? So in the fall, as I mentioned, I think we started doing some qualitative research. We've done 12, maybe 13, but I think 12 focus groups with about 50 students to try to understand the stories behind these numbers. The numbers are pretty convincing to us, but we want to understand both why these students experience higher rates, or what's going on that patterns it in the way that it does, but also what the different impacts on their lives and how food and housing insecurity shapes their experience as students. And so we did that research in the fall. In the spring, we're going to continue to do data analysis. We just still have some quantitative and qualitative data analysis to do, and publications. We're going to do another, we're really working hard to make sure that we can do another basic needs survey in April. We are, part of that is that we are seeking funding for that, and we think that we have that, and we'll go ahead with that. And then next fall, again, we will do another round of qualitative research and data gathering, where we will target more specific groups to understand their experiences more. As an ongoing set of activities, we are always seeking funding. So we're grant writing and seeking funding to continue this work that we think is really important. We have different parts of our project translating this research into interventions. And so we have some different things going on at UNM that is working towards addressing these issues. And then we're also working to collaborate with other institutions and other researchers and others kind of in the population more broadly, including legislators and policymakers. And so I think I'm going to stop here so that we can hear from some of the other people that we've been starting to collaborate with to see kind of their side of the story. So thank you very much. I don't know if we do questions now or later, but I'm happy to answer any.
Well, what I did is I asked people to write their questions in the chat, and Kathy's going to ask that on your behalf at the end. Before I turn it over to Stephanie, I just want to ask Sarita if she's got anything to add to this.
It might be best if I help answer questions when you're ready.
Okay, we'll do it that way then. Okay, well, this is a study that's related to UNM, but there's also hunger in New Mexico State University and Las Cruces, and just Stephanie Rogus is going to just give us a brief picture of what's happening and whether there are any plans to do a similar study there. It's all yours, Stephanie.
Thank you, and thanks for that presentation, Mary Gold. I have been collaborating, well, at least in talks with Mary Gold and Sarita since last spring, because another researcher and I at NMSU have been talking about doing a similar basic needs study at NMSU. And so I'll echo some of the points that Mary Gold made in terms of food and housing insecurity at UNM. A lot of the numbers that you're seeing in at least kind of the breakdown in terms of demographics and gender identities and whatnot are kind of similar across the nation in terms of what we're seeing at different colleges, and different universities do this in different ways. And so we see a lot of variation in terms of the numbers. So we've seen everywhere between 11 to 78% reported food insecurity at universities. The most common is about 35 to 50%. But again, it really ranges. But I think what we're seeing generally in terms of the trend is that it's higher than the general population. It's also tends to be higher at community colleges versus four-year colleges as well. And I like that you guys are looking at that double burden, because food and housing insecurity and some of the basic needs that people need to meet are going to be impacted at the same time, right? So it's really important to look at those things. So we started talking last spring, and although we have not run our survey yet, we have plans to run it this spring, and it would be the same kind of basic needs survey that UNM ran. And it's in that kind of development stage right now. And it's been in that stage for many months now. So we're actually working with our Office of Student Success and the Center for Community Analysis here at NMSU to run that same survey so that we can compare across universities. And I actually just had a conversation with someone at UTEP, so the University of Texas at El Paso, and they actually just ran a similar study as well. And so, we want to look at, in addition to students, we want to look at faculty and staff as well. And I believe that our findings will probably reflect what UNM has found, as well as what other universities around the country are finding, right? That, first generation students, international students, our Black, Indigenous, people of color, LGBTQ, single parents, students with disabilities are likely to be experiencing food insecurity and housing insecurity at higher rates than other students. And so we're planning to do the same thing, and then follow up with students or groups where we're seeing higher food insecurity rates to get that picture through focus groups and to gather qualitative data there. So just to give you a picture of kind of what we're seeing, what we've seen in the past, at least at NMSU, I'll give you a little bit of data. So in this project, we're working with our Aggie Cupboard, which is our food pantry at NMSU. And so they've collected some data on kind of what they're doing to help the students here at NMSU through the food pantry. And so in Doña County, we had about 16% food insecurity. That was the rate in 2018. We know that New Mexico's rate is much higher than the nation as a whole, and it's one of the highest rates in the whole country. And so NMSU actually ran, or one of the student groups, I believe in 2011, ran a daily living needs survey that showed that 44% of our students skipped meals monthly, that more than half reported having to choose between paying bills and buying groceries at least once, and 1 in 5 reported hunger regularly affected their grades and their ability to concentrate, which is kind of similar to what we're seeing in the UNM study. And so our Aggie Cupboard, supports our students, and they, at least in spring 2020, they served 546 unique clients and distributed almost 17,000 pounds of food, which is pretty impressive. They have one brick and mortar area where they distribute food, as well as a mobile food pantry. And just to give you a sense of their breakdown in terms of who uses the pantries, about at least in last spring, it was 12% grad students, 6% staff, and 33% undergrad students. A lot of those individuals that filled out the survey left that question blank, however. So we suspect that staff actually are suffering from food insecurity at pretty high rates at NMSU. So that's another thing that I guess I would add to Mary Gold's presentation, is that we're hoping to, to work with the university to get this survey sent out to kind of understand the entire picture of food insecurity and housing insecurity at NMSU, not just look at the students, but to look at the entire picture among faculty and staff as well. So, and just to close, I didn't want to take up too much time because I know that we'll be hearing from Representative Ferrari, who is my representative also, so that's great. But I think Mary Gold and Sarita and everyone on this call will agree that this is a particularly important time to be running a survey like this because of the current and ongoing economic impacts of the pandemic. So we are hoping to continue this collaboration with Mary Gold and Sarita, and to run our survey in the spring as well. So thank you so much, and thanks for having me.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I just wanted to add a couple of things that we also are aware that there's a high rate of food insecurity in among other colleges around and universities around the state of New Mexico. We did invite the gentleman from Northern New Mexico Community College and from another person from the College of Santa Fe Community College, and so they weren't able to attend, but I think they have some data also that would be helpful in creating a statewide picture of how hunger affects students around the state of New Mexico. I'll turn it on to Representative Ferrari. You can talk a little bit about whether House Bill 69 and whether there's anything in the works for this year. But I believe Representative Stansberry and Representative Bash were co-sponsors of that bill too. So I'll turn it over to Representative Ferrari, and she'll also tell us about the Hunger Caucus.
Oh, great. Thank you so much. And it's so nice to see everyone here tonight. House Bill 69 was an idea that our former Secretary of Health, Higher Education, I should say, had, and I was working with her Deputy Secretary, Carmen Lopez Wilson. And since now both are gone, I need to make sure that the new secretary has interest in, continuing to try and get this bill through. But it was pretty open. It's just to make an appropriation of $100,000 to the Higher Education Department for a pilot program to reduce college hunger. And it was pretty open, where within a year, the first year that this appropriation is for, they would set up as many different coordinators in the different schools. So they could do it with 5 schools and 20,000 each, or do it for more than that, 10 at 10,000. So it's pretty open to how the interest and what could be done in the different colleges and universities around the state. So what this was modeled after was Indiana initiated this, but they did it with like $1 million. And so all of their different universities, they had a coordinator, and then those coordinators would possibly do surveys, such as you've done at UNM and you're interested in at NMSU, and then also coordinating how leftover food could be used from the cafeterias and packaged, like we've talked about for our elementary or K through 12 schools might someday be able to do. And so there were a lot of different innovative ideas that these coordinators could try and investigate within their own college and see what would be appropriate and what might work to help mitigate the food insecurity at their university or college. So I'm hoping that we can introduce this again. I'm hoping that the budget will allow and have extra general fund money available, and and to have the support and the information from this UNM study, I think will be very helpful to try and pass this. Also then on the caucus, the House caucus, Representative Bash and Representative Stansberry and many of you have already been on the hunger, food, and water work group. And so what we're trying to do and to make sure that we can take that information and what we're going to do. And I'll have Representative Stansberry talk about, the initiatives and the food bill omnibus and how that's going to work. But we've been trying for past year to share the information and what the bills are and how to gain support for the different bills that for food insecurity and for helping the different food to table, the farmers and the producers, and getting them to the schools, the produce that's locally grown, things like that, and get the support of the caucus, the House and, well, I should say the legislative caucus on hunger. And so tonight we invited a lot of people, and I know there's so many different meetings going on and Zooms and opportunities that maybe that has made it difficult for people to join us. Senator Liz Stefanik is heading up the Senate side of the caucus, and we hope to continue as bills come through to transform the information about those bills and share it with our caucus for the support that we need as we go through the different committees and then onto the House floor. And as everyone, because of COVID, has exposed how really important it is for providing the different distribution for from the food banks and to the pantries in rural areas and throughout the state, as well as supporting farmers and ranchers to get their products to market and into New Mexico system, as well as healthy soil and how to encourage, things like that. So there's from the food, hunger, ag and water policy work group, there's a lot of different initiatives that we need to expose people to the information, and the caucus especially. So with that said, Representative Stansberry, if you're available to talk a little bit about some of the bills and how things are going.
Sure. So first of all, thank you guys so much for your presentation and for the research that you're doing. I'm interested to hear a little bit tonight, if there's time, just, if you have had the opportunity to talk to your university leadership, like the president's offices and chancellor office at NMSU, about your findings and kind of what the response is. And I'm wondering if there's things that can be baked into the higher ed budget, aside from the budget bill that Representative Ferrari was just talking about, maybe into the operational budget of the universities. But with regards to the food, hunger, and ag bill, we've been meeting for the last year and a half through a pretty expansive work group that includes everyone from agricultural producers and nonprofit and market organizations that help support farmers, both at the commercial and small scale, production scale, food banks, nonprofit organizations, advocacy organizations, anti-poverty groups, et cetera, et cetera. And the point of those conversations was really to connect the dots between hunger on one side of the continuum and our food system on the other side of the continuum, because oftentimes those conversations don't happen in the same place and time. We try to figure out how do we, make food systems more resilient and more economically viable over here, and then we try to solve hunger over here as a social challenge. And so I think part of the solution is really what I've been calling, how do we repatriate our food system locally and make sure that healthy food can get into the mouths of hungry people, and also as part of that repatriation, bring cultural foods back and local food and all that stuff. So anyway, the bill that we're working on has been a compilation over many, many months of different ideas about how we do that. And so it has 3 sections in it. We're currently working on the drafting. A final draft is a bit delayed because our legislative council is a bit overwhelmed. Every other year when we have a policy session, there's just a deluge of bills that get filed at the end. So I'm going to share a Word draft of the bill in our Thursday luncheon meeting. But the 3 sections of the bill, the first section is really directs our state agencies and Department of Ag to implement an approach to addressing, comprehensive approach to addressing food and hunger and agricultural sustainability and resilience, and some of the structural and infrastructure challenges with why our food system is broken. The second part of the bill deals with emergency hunger relief and how we respond to and make food available in emergency situations like the pandemic and the work that the food banks and pantries do. And then the third section of the bill is how do we reform and improve our social services and income support programs so that they're client-centered and really respect the dignity, and I think speaks to the research that Marigold presented that, hunger doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's happening for people as a symptom of the other social and economic challenges that they're facing. So it really directs the state to optimize its flexibility and improve the way that it does sort of client outreach on social income support programs. So that's kind of the current approach. We had originally started calling it an omnibus. my original kind of theory was that we could do like a big comprehensive farm bill like happens at the federal level. And just with the pandemic and meeting virtually and the challenges of bringing bills together, it's just one bill as opposed to a bunch of bills combined. But there will be other bills that other groups will introduce as well. And our coalition tries to find common ground so that we can speak with one voice as an ag and food community to help support kind of the entire, food system reforms that are needed. So I know I threw a lot of information. Come to our meeting on Thursday, noon.
Okay, I think we can get to the questions now, and Kathy's gonna be asking the questions.
Sorry, my dogs just went crazy the moment I hit unmute. Sorry about that. So just a statement from Sarita at first. She states that 34 million Americans have some college credit and no degree, which often means more debt and poverty for those who've dropped out, which is another statistic, which I can't say, to follow. Ellen Buelow has a question. She wants to know, I guess for Mary Gold, your study, does it include access to food banks, SNAP, or other resources? If not, is there an outreach effort for students?
That's a great question. And we do have, in addition to the food and housing and security information that I threw at you, which was a lot, we do have some other questions in there. And one is access to different sources and resources. And we haven't really managed to slog through that very much. We do know that, well, two things. We know that it's hard for students to be eligible for SNAP. And because of the work requirements that they have to have. Many students, though, are eligible for SNAP, and we know that students across the board, across the country, but also in our sample, students underutilize SNAP even when they are eligible. So one thing that actually the state of California has done is the state of California has changed some of their SNAP eligibility requirements that make it easier for students to be eligible for SNAP. And so that could be a possibility for New Mexico as well. But we do know students underutilize SNAP even when they are eligible, but it's hard for students to be eligible because of the work requirements in SNAP. We also know that students underutilize the food pantry. We had two food pantries on campus. We had the mobile food pantry in South Lot, and then we have also the on-campus food pantry, which started up a year ago as well. But we know that it's also underutilized. And in our qualitative research, we sort of asked questions about if students are accessing that, why or why not, what would help them access it. And obviously stigma and embarrassment and shame is huge in this population. This population is a young population who feels those kinds of stigmas very strongly. And so many students who are even, food insecure don't access it. And then those who do access it sometimes talk about how stigmatizing it is to access the food pantry. So we've talked about with the students, well, how could we make it less stigmatizing? And so there's a lot of effort to talk about how to normalize, how to just share the information with people that 1 in 3, like if you look to your left and look to your right, somebody in this class is going to be food insecure. So we know your classmates are food insecure. It's relatively normal, and there are resources and you should use them. We are also trying to work with other places on campus where they help students apply for SNAP benefits or find out more about SNAP benefits. The application process for SNAP is complicated and difficult for students to get through. So there's support for that here on campus as well. So we do have a little bit of this. I didn't report on it today. We haven't really kind of slogged through that data very much yet, but we know students underutilize it. Oh, one other thing that we found from the qualitative focus groups is that students, there's something about being a college student that it's supposed to be hard. that it's supposed to be, you know, we have the idea of the starving student, we have the jokes about, oh, I survived on ramen packets for 2 years, and it sort of normalizes food insecurity among this population. And so actually a lot of times students don't feel like the food pantry is for them. They don't feel like they're bad enough off to be able to utilize it. They say things like, oh, I really want to not take advantage of those resources because I want families or single parents to be able to access that. And so another thing that we're kind of working on is normalizing the fact that people need help, and it's not okay to be hungry. It's not okay to be food insecure, and there are resources. So normalizing accessing resources, and then normalizing that it's for everybody, and destigmatizing that as well. Sarita could maybe talk a little bit more about that, or she's also speaking later this month too, to talk a little bit more about that effort. But we do have a pantry on campus, and it is heavily used, especially right now. And sometimes they aren't able to serve all the needs.
Very good. Thanks for sharing that perspective. It's been a long time since I was a college student, but but you're right, and I love that holistic approach as far as trying to make it accessible to them and letting them. That's a good skill to have for life, you know, to be able to reach out. Definitely. Part of us on the Interfaith Hunger Coalition, we love to share resources or find a way to do that. So I think that's why it really connects to the work that we do. Representative Stansberry mentioned this when she was speaking. She was curious if the data had been presented to the university leadership. And if so, what's the thought about that, or some options when it comes to food insecurity and housing insecurity?
Yeah, we've shared it across the board with all of the different leadership. We've shared it as widely as our own personal networks can bear. You might have seen it a couple of times come across your email as well. We have not gotten a response from the president, but the provost has been very responsive. And there's been some changeover in the chancellor's office. And so the chancellor was particularly supportive of doing this research, especially the housing research. The chancellor is of the health sciences campus. And then the provost is also really quite supportive. One of our team members, Heather Meckler, is in the director of the Office of Institutional Analytics, and she is, that's located right in the provost's office. And the provost has committed funds for us. He's committed that we're going to continue doing this. And he convened a task force at UNM, which Dr. Kargas can talk a little bit more about. But there is a task force that's going forward. There's lots of different voices. There's lots of different perspectives. And we don't want to be, we want to support what the campus is already doing, you know, the Division of Student Services, et cetera, support them, and not, but nonetheless, this research is challenging sometimes to accept and hear, and we don't want it to come across too much of as a critique, except we do want to say we really want more to be done. So it has been a little bit of a challenge, but nonetheless, the provost is absolutely supportive, and the task force is moving forward, and he has put his staff, kind of has charged his staff to move that forward. Go for it, Sarita.
Add to that, it is a challenge to get the university to respond, right? We need more than a pantry. We have a giant systemic problem of students who don't have enough financial aid, and it's a national problem. Our data is in line with the entire nation of 1 in 3 college students being hungry more or less at different universities. Public universities have more of a problem, and the universities don't fund basic needs security. It's not part of their vision. And so we need to really change this norm and say, if students are to graduate, we need to help them with basic services. So our research has shown that institutional or instructional costs, there's not been much investment in instruction, right? We don't pay professors a lot more. We don't hire a lot more professors in the last decade, but student services have skyrocketed. There's legions of staff to help students because we know students need more to graduate than just lectures. And yet none of that money goes towards food and housing. It goes towards a fancy gym or advising and ethnic service centers. But we would love to change that norm and say, we need to fund the pantry. It's open 2 hours a week, and we need to do more than a pantry. We need to find other ways to give groceries to students. The stigma is turning out to be a huge problem, Marigold and I are finding out. So yes, we've got the university's attention. Our research got us invited to a lot of meetings. There was a lot of attention at the beginning, but what we would love to talk to the legislators more is how could we work with you to pressure the university to do more? Because we don't totally understand legislation on the task force. We do have a government office that I'm talking to you, and they're telling me to be cautious about approaching you and being, appropriate. But how could we work together to pressure the university more, to acknowledge the problem, not to embarrass the university, but to say this is a systemic problem that I think you have a moral responsibility to do more about. So we're trying to figure out, the task force has a curriculum piece. What can we do more about curriculum? A legislative piece. How can we, and who should we contact about doing more? And what is a legislative piece? What is a development piece? What just needs more money thrown at it? And how do we make this a statewide task force? So we would love to talk to you further about how and where to pressure the university to do more.
So if I could quickly respond, just two things that immediately come to mind, and maybe kind of reframing. It may be that the university leadership is interested but doesn't know themselves how to respond. But two things that sort of immediately come to mind. We succeeded in passing a school lunch reduction bill in the legislature this last year. And essentially what it did is it was a sort of nominal state investment in leveraging the federal school lunch program, so that it would take away the barrier for reduced price lunches to make them free, because like the stigma, we could feed another 20-some thousand students if we took that stigma away for reduced price lunch. And the research that was done to identify that very nominal incremental state investment came from Appleseed, which is an organization that works a lot on hunger, and they do evidence-based policy development. And so they would be the ideal partner in my mind, for you guys to potentially talk to identify, are there federal programs or state programs that could be leveraged to bring more resources? And then the other thing that also comes to mind is our food and hunger group meets with the philanthropic community every second Tuesday. And I just sat in on the last report. Collectively, I think our philanthropic community has invested over $10 million this year in emergency food assistance, and they're certainly interested in continuing to support work. So there might be an opportunity to make a pitch to philanthropy to kind of help figure out what the next step would be. So just kind of planting that seed. And if you guys want to follow up, you can just send me an email and I'll connect the dots.
Thank you very much.
That's a very, very good conversation to have. Thanks, guys. And thanks for your passion. That's wonderful to hear. So it was a question about surveying students as to why they were more food insecure than gen population. Is the soaring cost of college, along with the minimum wage staying stagnant, less job opportunities, a big reason for why college students have less money for food than the rest of the population?
Yeah, so there's lots of reasons why this might be the case for young people. A couple of them have to do with the cost of college and the ways that financial aid has not kept up. It also has to do with how college students are changing. We see there's a lot more inclusion, there's a lot more diversity, there is a lot more first-gen students who are participating, and so students don't necessarily have the same kind of parental support and resources, family resources or financial resources going into college. And that's a good thing, right? It's a good thing that we are much more diverse in the undergraduate population. But we know that financial aid absolutely in real terms has not kept up. The cost of going to college has skyrocketed, and financial aid has just inched along if it has gotten more at all. So that's part of it. But there are some other things too that we're finding, like one thing that I was just reminded of this, and I was reading a paper from another university, and it reminded me of some of our qualitative research findings that young people don't necessarily have the skills, the financial skills to manage scarce budgets. They don't necessarily have the skills to access resources. There's a lot of, like we've already talked about stigma, but I think for this population in general, figuring out and accessing resources, there's such an embarrassment and shame around that. And it's so relevant and important for these young adults. So there are, in addition to just, just costs, there are some sort of skills development. And one thing you hear again and again is like, how do we build curriculum that helps students manage small budgets and access resources and develop those skills, because the students don't always have that. So lots of different kinds of reasons. But I also think that probably this population, the student population, had high food insecurity for a long time. It's not that it's a new thing. We do have that sort of assumption or that lore about the starving student. And we just hadn't done the research on it before. So I don't know that it's necessarily that much worse. I do think that the costs are going up and the kinds of students that are on campus have changed. But I suspect it's been actually a long-standing problem, and it's multiple. The other thing that happens, one thing that we're really finding is that these rates, the prevalence is so incredibly high among LGBTQ students, and there's something that happens right at this age for young people when they leave their family's home, and then they can actually come out, or they can transition, or they can live the lives that they were meant to live. And I think that this is a particularly rocky period for that group of students in terms of their community and family support, that they just don't have that. So in terms of that particular group, community and family support is particularly low right now in this age group. So it's a whole range of different things that we're finding about why this population has such high rates.
We just have a few more questions we want to get through quickly. The study was for UNM. Do you know if there's been a study for C&M or other community college students?
The kind of representative sample that we've done is, I think, unique across the board. But as Stephanie mentioned, there's been lots of smaller kinds of studies in different places. We do know that community college students across the board and other places have significantly higher rates than four-year colleges. We know that private institutions tend to have still high food insecurity, but there's a whole range. We might expect that UNM actually is among the public New Mexico institutions would be relatively well off because it is the flagship. So we would expect that in other kinds of institutions, especially two-year institutions, that it would be higher. We have started talking to and working with people in different institutions as well to support some of these studies elsewhere.
Good. We have a lot of people who'd love to advocate with you for change. On our call, Loopy Conscious is here for Bread for the World. So if you had a letter template or something that we could send out to advocate to our legislators, and plus I'd love to see this PowerPoint as well. I'm sure Carlos is going to give us a copy of that so we can have that statistics for our work as well. So.
Yeah, so two things. One is that we have published a report, and we have two things. One is a report that's, for kind of a broader audience, so like this audience, that would kind of breaks all these down, all the demographics down a little bit more even specifically. So you can find that at our website or email me at all if you are interested in that. We have a small infographic that is just a 2-pager that sort of identifies what the issues are as well, and that's on our website. Also, I love the idea of a letter template. One thing that we're working on right now actively is to create a syllabus notification. So at the beginning of all classes, there's always a syllabus that the professor will hand out, and we're developing language, some template language for syllabi, so that faculty can sort of articulate, ways that there are resources that are available, normalize and make students more aware of it. So that sort of idea of developing templates is something that we're working on. And the letter template is fantastic. I am developing right now a letter to the university because they've decided to close family housing, and family housing closing is sort of a big deal because there's very few places to have affordable housing, and it was also really important for international students. So I'm developing a letter, and so I love developing templates, and we'll kind of keep doing that and post them on my website. And of course, anybody can email me as those become available. I can send those out as well. Thank you so much for that.
Sarah actually has a comment here from she knows a college student who was denied SNAP because UNM financial aid wouldn't send over the financial info proving of her income and costs. So that's a vicious circle, I think.
You know, just to comment on that, one of the things that came out of our qualitative research as well is how difficult the financial aid office is to work with. And I don't think it's just UNM. We're finding this in the research across the board that financial aid officers are hard to work with. Our students tell us that, you know, sometimes you get one good, really amazing financial aid officer who will connect you with lots of resources and be able to tell you a straight answer. And then over here, you'll kind of come a different day and talk to a financial aid officer that is not able to even understand what you're going through at all. And so working with financial aid in general is something that I think in the long run is part of what's going to be on the task force. And I just want to emphasize, this is not a UNM problem. We see this in the literature across the board that, you know, resources are scarce. And so they actually, you know, are trying to be really put boundaries around them and be really careful with their resources, which I understand, but it is notoriously difficult to work with financial aid officers.
Sarah actually has a good response to that. She says the Women's Resource Center at UNM is especially helpful in filling out SNAP applications. They will help any student. So,
yep, any student, and it is not just women. Absolutely.
Great. Here's a question. Did someone say comment?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
Okay, this is a question from Melanie. They want information about the meeting that she invited us to.
I see that Carlos put the information down a little bit lower.
I haven't scrolled down far.
Yeah, if
Okay.
Carlos could circulate, or Ellen, to the group, that would be great.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks.
Yep. We're almost done. Just some comments and stuff about students coming to the Roadrunner Food Bank Mobile Food Pantry at Eugene Field Elementary School. There's the meeting. Sorry, scrolling down now. Thursday's meeting, courtesy of Sharon Berman from New Mexico First. So there's information there. Make sure you go to the chat to cut and paste if you need to get that Zoom link. So please do that. Again, kudos to the UNM Women's Resource Center for applying for SNAP. Can the state legislature change the work requirements for SNAP to include full-time students as work compliant, or is that a federal requirement?
I see that there was an answer to that question
on that. We are exploring that. Nobody at UNM is sure. There's a number of rules we'd like to look into, and we're not sure what is federal. I mean, it's a federally mandated program, but the states are in charge of some rules. And California has been successful at making SNAP more useful to college students. So we're in the process of looking at that. Government Relations doesn't know the rules. I mean, why would they? They don't specialize in SNAP. So our task force has someone from the provost's office, and she's volunteered to get a UNM lawyer to look into that. One thing we want to use is SNAP benefits on campus, and they can't currently use them in the little convenience stores on campus. It may be because they serve hot food. There's particular rules around what percentage of that convenience store. So we're in the process of trying to figure out what's just a rule that would be easier to change and what involves legislation. But we are very curious that could they use food stamps to have a meal program? Some research shows if they participate in a meal program, which students think, of course, is very expensive because they have to pay hundreds of dollars up front, actually can help with food security to part of a meal plan, but you can't use food stamps. So anyway, if anybody has insight on those rules or who to go to, we're very interested.
So
I have talked to Tim Davis.
Oh, good. Yeah, Tim and Derek Lynn does work on this at Voices for Children, and they know this statute and regulations pretty
Tim,
well.
I'm not too sure about the college student stuff. Anyway, we'll try, Derek, and keep working on it.
The big thing that they did in California was they made it so that work study jobs could be recognized as employment, which in not all states is work study recognized. And that didn't make everybody eligible, but that really did increase the percentage of students who were eligible by quite a lot.
I don't know, that was the last question that we had, but we also have an invitation from Caroline Kastner. It says the Food Depot will stream free and on demand the 2019 documentary Hungry to Learn. The information is there in our chat. Thank you for that invitation. So you can join that as well. So I think that was all of the questions and statements. So I hand it over to Carlos to wrap it up.
Yes, I want to thank everyone for taking time to spend an hour and a half on this discussion. This is all very interesting. I have all of your emails, and so we're also, since this was recorded, we're gonna put it out. Sometimes people don't want to sit through an hour and a half, but yeah, you can watch whatever you want to from this, but we'll have this available. Again, thank you, and watch for our next Zoom meeting. And our education committee hasn't decided whether we're going to do a February or a March meeting, but we haven't decided on the topic. And also keep an eye out for anything coming out of the state legislature. But again, thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you for having
organizing. Happy New Year to everybody.
Happy New Year.
Thank you, everybody.
Happy New Year. Nice to see everybody.